And if you have noticed, many organizations have recently implemented the system of the Texas of the surveillance cameras. This way, Telcar places cameras in strategic locations and has a monitoring center, imitating government surveillance centers because they've noticed. In the long run, it is cheaper and more practical to have cameras than punteros. With this method, you save on radios and people's wages, but let's be honest, nothing beats human resources. Here I show you a video of a place that the government claimed was used as a surveillance center. Now, here's the image of a government surveillance center. Now let's talk about drones that are used at the border to detect border patrol and also to monitor the path of undocumented immigrants crossing. They also use them a lot in Ocran to detect camps that rival groups have, and they are used in other places in Mexico. And as I was saying, all of this imitating law enforcement that also uses drones to locate targets. Here, I'm going to show you the drones that they use in Ocran and also what they use in the government. All right, before talking about some stories within the Sinaloa organization, first let me tell you that, although you may not believe it, but the presence of lookouts in certain areas or communities have negative effects, especially when people who are not familiar with this environment see them. It creates a feeling of insecurity, and sometimes the presence of the punteros scares people, and that it has a negative economic impact. Why? Because sometimes people won't go to certain places or businesses anymore where they know there are punteros because it scares them and therefore businesses lose out. Although this is not always the case, because just like many citizens, they feel fear and insecurity when they see the lookouts, because they see them as a threat to the security of the community. There are also cases where the punteros are sometimes seen as victims of circumstances, and sometimes they provide support to businesses when there is some theft or robbery. Even sometimes when someone gets a flat tire, the spotters go and help them out to change their tire, etc. Sometimes people who are used to this, well, the punteros, and they see the opposite. They see security in them, since they feel protected by some member of the organization that has control there. All right, friends. As I mentioned before, lookouts are not only meant to stay in one spot and observe the actions of the government. It's not like that because there is also other work, which isn't called puntero, but basically does the same job. Because many times organizations send a scout, a lookout, to hunt a certain objective. For example, in shopping malls, when it's known that a target is inside the mall, a person who knows the target is sent, and their mission is to locate him and report his movements so that the man-gun can arrive and do their job. And what is this? Is to resign or to give him a ride. A very real example is from the time of Julio Beltran's father. This character was handed the resignation inside a shopping center, the logistics. That's how it was. Someone said he was going to the mall. A person who knew him physically was sent, and when he was there with a cell phone, they would be giving reports of what was happening, and the guys arrived and did their job. Also, sometimes people are sent to bars to see who's there, and with whom they are, or what they are drinking, about seeing how much they're spending, like those who spend a lot in clubs. Same thing if they are hunting someone. So they go into the club, locate him, and I'll show you another example. The one Ivan Archibaldo sent to do these missions at the restaurants and clubs was Jimmy Fernandez. He was always at the clubs taking photos, spotting people, and he was the one who would inform Archibaldo. And then they'd send the guys to do what they had to do. If you only knew how many people was resigned because of that. But I will touch on that in another episode. For now, here's a photo of Jimmy just so you can know him. Okay, as I already told you, this job has been around since the 80s or even earlier, but the reality is, It wasn't crucial or important for the people back then, since there were no patrols or checkpoints like the ones present nowadays. I'm talking about the times of Caro Quintero, more or less. Like I said, some people smartly took the need for lookouts seriously, but some others did not thin about it. And let me give you an example of something that was talked about a lot many years ago in Culiacan. It was the arrest of Javier Torres Felix, also known as JT. Since in those years, Javier was a high-ranking member of the Sinaloa organization and moved freely throughout the mountains and Culiacan in huge caravans. But here is what I'm telling you, his capture. Why it happened. Well, I'll tell you that happened because the man went to a dance at a celebration in a ranch. And on the way back, he ran into a military checkpoint, which led to a confrontation, in which a military officer ended up resigned. In those events, JT managed to escape and went home. But immediately the government organized an operation and captured him at a residence located in Colinas de San Miguel in the city of Culiacan, Sinaloa. So you see, often the government knows where most of the key figures are, but they let them be until they get the order from above to go after them. This way, the government knew that Javier Torres cruised around everywhere and knew where he was. But obviously they let him be, but he made the mistake of resigning the military, and that cost him his freedom. And as a result of that failure, he's already been in prison for more than 20 years. Just take a look. If he had his men at his disposal with their equipment, what would it have cost him to bring just one in another car ahead as a lookout? That way, he would have realized about the checkpoint, avoided it, and avoided everything else. That's why I repeated a lot about how important Punteros can be for the organization. Pay attention. Javier has been in prison for 20 years now, and I believe freedom is priceless. And here, I'll show you a picture of Mr. Javier Torres. By the way, I send my regards to his children and nephews. They are good friends, and by the way, a very special shout-out to Uncle Javier. Well, after that event, for many people in the Telcar, it was a turning point in the decision to use Punteros. And everyone decided to place Punteros in their areas of influence, or the territory they commanded. But no one had a network of Punteros throughout Culiacan, even though everyone passed through there and everyone had their families, properties, and interests in Culiacan very well. In my view, there were 5 people. Obviously, there were more, but I'll talk about what I was able to investigate. Well, there were people who took excellent care of their lands, in terms of having the Halcones in strategic places. I'm referring, number 1, to the Yoma in El Salado and the neighboring towns. And along the entire free highway to Mazatlan, he had his network of points. The Pocha in La Tuna and the surroundings had lookouts watching the roads and government aircraft flying overhead. In the Dorado area, it was El Licenciado. He also set up a network of Punteros all through the highway from Culiacan to Mazatlan. Emilio Casares in the area of his ranch, El Guayabito, and all the way along the road from the junction. From Pericos to Badiraguato, he had his network of lookouts. And another one I can mention who took good care of positioning the puntos, or lookouts, and who always ensured all the lookouts paid attention to their work, was Manuel Valenzuela Portillo. From the Portezuelo, he coordinated his punteros very well and knew exactly all the government activities in his area. Now I'm going to tell you a bit about Culiacan. In Culiacan, there was a radio channel called General. That's what that frequency was called. That frequency, it was from the part of the Yoma. But people from Pocha also used that frequency, and also Licenciado's people. Well, that line wasn't specifically for lookouts or punteros. That line had many purposes in it. They coordinated to use or carry out liftings or ask for favors when there was a missing person. Or they reported suspicious vehicles and asked if they belonged to the people. But it was also used for when some people had that line They were watching government units, that's where they reported them, and well, everyone could hear it there. And also, there were people who carried more than one radio channel, and if they heard on another radio that the units were in a sector, so this person did the favor of reporting it through the main line or the general line. This main line, it was the closest thing they had back then in Culiacan to keep track of military or police units on the streets. But as I was saying, since that frequency was not exclusively for government unit monitoring, it was never known for sure what was on the street, and look how curious that is. Since everyone was in Culiacan, but it was the place with the least surveillance. Because in the ranches and roads or highways, everything was very well monitored there. Then some people started to set up lookouts, but only in the neighborhoods where they lived and were not 100% secure. But they only placed 1 or 2 guys at the most important entrances and exits, where there were fixed points, were the airports. And to the zones and military bases, the Punteros are the ones who should be more in compliance. Having everything in rule, referring to cars with plates, bikes with plates, nothing illegal, discreet, without looking suspicious because there are some, whether they carry tacor or gastro, etc., and that's not right. The Punteros need to know what their job is. And to do it right, they need to be able to pass through government areas without issues, carrying nothing that could get them arrested. And don't think it's just the military, Marines, and National Guard that they have to keep. No, because in certain places they do have to be on the watch for the municipal and the state police. Everything. For example, there is one that just got caught from the Michoacan family in the state of Mexico, by the area of Geographic. He was doing his job monitoring, and the police saw that the car had no plates. That's why I tell you, they have to be in full compliance. And because of that, they stopped him, checked him. You know, the police noticed radios, phones with logos and stickers from the Michoacan family. A fish and a strawberry. These are the nicknames of the leaders of this organization. Here, I'm going to show you images so you can see how they were. That's an abuse. It's nonsense. Well, this puntero, it was mobile because, as I told you, there are punteros. Nesting those that are only in a specific place. And there are others that are mobile lookouts that have a vehicle to move around the designated area. They can be called monitors because sometimes when government units enter a certain area, in some places where they might get lost, monitors are sent to follow them and keep track of their location. And check what is the government doing. Like there are lookouts for when someone important goes. They can go ahead in a vehicle to alert if there are checkpoints or government units. And also, sometimes a puntero goes behind the convoy, but for several miles, so that the character is better taken care of, just like when transporting goods on the highways. They always send a car ahead to warn if there are checkpoints and if that's the case, either fix it or notify the vehicle carrying the merchandise so it stops moving. The fixed points. They always try to camouflage themselves as watchmen of a business or are at gas stations and many times on the roofs of some construction site or abandoned houses. They look for places where they feel the safest, and that's why they look for businesses to pretend they're working there. Here, I'm going to show you another video, what they make the lookouts do when they catch them. Well, as I said before, Culiacan didn't have a network of lookouts specifically for government surveillance. That was created in 2014 after they caught Pocha, because they saw that the government's operations were over the top and they were working non-stop. So initially a line was created that was just a communication network to keep track of where the government was, and this started with say now. Activating the radios for anyone who wanted to be cautious. The only condition was that they had to report what they knew was happening on the streets. Of course, from the government. The frequency was free. Only those who wanted the line had to buy their own radio, and it was activated when it started. There were approximately 200 radios, and the people who ran that line were from Yoma, from Pocha, who were the Chapitos, and the Licenciado, also people from Tamazula. So the radios were always on and blasting, reporting government from everywhere, but like everything, nothing is perfect, and there was no certainty where the government was. Where was the government at any time? Because at night, most people were asleep and the government patrolling the street at those hours was not reported. That's how a better designed and more organized plan was created to monitor and watch and track all the units that were out on the street 24 hours a day. As I tell you back then. And at that time, there were bases set up by the Navy and others that had been established earlier and so on. Each nest, as they were called, was given a fixed point, so they could monitor every time vehicles went in and out. That's how it happened. In Parque 87, one for Colonia, 6th of January, Nido del Castillo, Nido de la Palma, Nido de la Fermer. With a city map where all the streets could be seen, a study was done, and people were sent out to the streets to observe what was the best place, and determine points where most of the streets crossed. As everyone knows, there are main boulevards and avenues where most vehicles travel. After all of this was analyzed, points that were fixed, Punteros were installed in all those places, on the main boulevards, avenues, and streets, in shopping malls, gas stations, stores, city entrances and exits, and so on. Everywhere considered necessary, along with military bases, naval bases, and airports, in the state attorney offices. But don't think this was only in Culiacan, because military zones were also being watched and military bases, military zones like in Culiacan, Badiraguato, San Jose del Llano, the Saus, Guamuchi, Los Mochis, as well as the airports of Culiacan, Mazatlan, Los Mochis, Durango, La Paz, and San Jose, Baja California. And as I tell you, also at the Navy bases. Everywhere, because they're in Mazatlan, Topolobampo, La Paz, and others I'm forgetting. Well, in Culiacan, there was a kind of division, which were the rivers or bridges. So they placed punteros on all the bridges, so it was known if the units were on one side of the river or the other, of the city. So people who knew that could move from one side of Culiacan to the other. As I explained to you, in all the bases and airports there were lookouts to get information about the helicopters. Located at the airports and what kind they were, and their number. Also, in the airport control towers there were people from the organization who reported the routes of government planes and helicopters to know the route. Although they often flew with a private flight plan, but in some other times they make it public. That way, it was known if a military helicopter took off from an airport in Durango, La Paz, or Mazatlan, even Los Mochis. And that way, people, or the bosses, could stay alert until the helicopter landed at another point. With all the checkpoints along the highways, the aircraft's course was monitored. The Culiacan-Mazatlan free highway was divided, so to speak, into two sections. In a section from Culiacan to Elota. There, the Yoma people were the ones monitoring and alerting about anything. This person was usually Meño, the character from the Corrido 4x1. From Elota to Mazatlan, it was the Licenciado's people. The highway from Culiacan to Mazatlan was all the Licenciado people. And the person in charge of that task, that was from Culiacan to Elota. But via the Maxipista it was Cuatro or Puñetas, and from Elota to Mazatlan it was another person. The Navolato area from Costa de Culiacan was controlled by the Licenciado. From El Trebol to Guamuchil, that was under the Chapitos men, those who had the lookouts through Angostura. From Culiacan to Pericos, it was the Licenciado, the one who had the points, and similarly from the Pericos Junction to Badiraguato, it was also the people of Licenciado. From Badiraguato onward, it was Manuel Valenzuela Portillo's territory, and further up the people handled by Guano. From Culiacan to Sanalona, the one who had the Halcones was Arli on part of Licenciado. And from Sanalona, further up from Tamazula, it was Meño and Eligio who were monitoring the area. On Los Mochis, El Fuerte and that area weren't well organized in terms of lookouts. There were only a few. In the most important places such as airports, military bases, and some points on the highway. That place was also with the Licenciado people. In Mazatlan, everything was equally organized with the Punteros scheme, but there it was operated in a different way, since it was via BlackBerry. There was a group responsible for all the points in the city reporting there, and in the end, of all, nobody knew who had the BlackBerry. Everything was communicated through BlackBerry. The one who was using that system was Rene, the 00 on behalf of the Licenciado. From Villa Union to the south up to the end of the state belonged to Los Chapitos. They were the ones who monitored those areas. So everyone pitched in, and when someone wanted to go to a specific area, they just asked for information, how the area was doing, and immediately reported what was happening. In Culiacan, they implemented a kind of base or monitoring center where all the information was gathered and it was named the office. That way the office had communication with all the punteros and monitors in Culiacan, and also with the managers of all the area's points via radio and cell phone. And their job consisted of keeping track of units on the street and what they were doing. Similarly, they had to know how many units were in transit when they were traveling on a highway, for example, from Culiacan to Mazatlan. In the unit count, they had to know how many were fast, how many were slow, how many were big, and how many armored vehicles and how many helicopters or aircrafts they had at each base, and how many aircrafts were in the air, in case anyone wanted to move from Culiacan to Navolato, for instance, they would ask at the office. The government movement in the area and the office informed what was traveling on the Culiacan to Navolato road. 2 fast ones, and in the Navolato sector, there were 3 slow ones shopping in the supermarket. That's how they had to be monitoring most of the state of Sinaloa. The office's function, it was also about keeping all the punteros in Culiacan always on alert, so out of nowhere, the office would call any puntero. And if the person didn't answer, it was a sign they weren't paying attention, and they would get reprimanded. Also, if any unit passed by them unnoticed or they didn't report it, the office had at its disposal a group of mangun. They were the ones in charge of lining up the lookouts, meaning they would correct them by hitting them with boards. Although for this, all the Tolerospi immediately jumped to do the favor when they were near a spot, and knowing they were going to get a quick reprimand, they would jump in, saying they would handle it. I don't understand why there's always such a rush to hit people, honestly. Also, in the network of lookouts, there has to be an office responsible for handing out batteries because there are many points without access to a charger. The office has to have dozens of batteries ready and charged to send them where they are needed. In any case, they also bring them food. At night, roll call would be conducted every so often to check that they were not sleeping or not paying attention. A list was checked approximately every 30 minutes, from point to point where they had to report. Sometimes they were organized. Depending on how the points were arranged, sometimes they were checked randomly to catch those not paying close attention. Back then, they also acquired two-wheeled motorcycles called monitors or little horses. These little horses were in charge of chasing or following government units, to always keep them in sight, whether they were moving around or stopped in a certain place. And the officers would get out of the vehicles. They always had to be following him. At night, taxis were used. About 20 taxis were bought, all marked and with their official permits. Everything was in order, and they installed radios in the taxis that supposedly had the frequency used by taxi drivers for when they were notified about picking up a fare, but obviously the line they were actually running was the Punteros line, because that was their job, being out in the early hours when there's almost no vehicle movement, and if they were stopped, they'd say they were picking up a passenger and had a kill switch in the radio, in case they were stopped, to activate it immediately and disable the radio. In case the military wanted to hear the radio, so then taxi drivers usually said their car's radio were broken or not working. Also, something they used a lot was keeping some women's on the payroll, that when they had to follow military units, they would get into the taxi posing as passengers and normally pretended to be sex workers and said that they were going, or they came from a job, to justify the time and place where they were. So everything had to be very well monitored and everything was well organized, always knowing where each unit was and the exact number of them. But still, they also had to report the units from the municipal police, ministerial police, and state police, garbage trucks, vehicles from the Federal Commission of Electricity and company vehicles, because it was known that sometimes the government used those types of vehicles to camouflage and go unnoticed. Even though the municipal police and the state ones are all on the Telcar payroll, well, you couldn't trust it because sometimes military personnel would also get on those patrols. As I have already told you, at 12 o'clock at night, the roll call started for all the Punteros. Every half hour, or if it was very busy, every 15 minutes, from the first point to the last one. Everyone has to check in, and if they don't, the office sends someone to look for them to see if they're asleep or if they weren't where they were supposed to be. Shifts were 12 hours of work followed by 12 hours of rest, and then the relay would come in. The monitors work through the phone so they don't carry a radio and chase government units, because they would get the radio broken on their heads, or they are confiscated, and it is a hassle to change the line and activate that line on all the radios. This is how the Telcar managed to create an impressive network of Punteros all along the state of Sinaloa. Easily, and without fear of being wrong, there were more than 1,500. Right now in Culiacan, it's divided by sectors and with different lines. Before, it was just one. But even so, they continue using an office where they concentrate all the information. And believe me, there are too many people, and things often start to get out of hand. Because some points want to sell weed, and that causes more trouble, and others go around, intoxicated, and start seeing things that aren't there. Some others ask for permission to get in Tacor, and in many cases they don't ask for authorization, and that causes problems. And sometimes they ask to have a Tacor in case there are robbers, for the thieves. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is when they sell the information to people who do not know what they are going to use it for. Because they can be the organization's own enemies or people who do not work for the company, and they just take advantage of the resources. These outsiders would give 2,000 pesos a week and have information worth millions of pesos a week, but they only get 2,000 pesos. And because of that, the lookouts get into big trouble. A factor they realized didn't work is that before they gived in some sectors, but not in all cases, obviously, but they tried to give places to the Punteros. For example, they'd buy a house, a small building, where they had kitchen comforts, bathroom, living room, light, electric light, air conditioning, conditioned, etc. That way, the points were secure and not at risk because they were inside a property. But having all those comforts, the lookouts would take advantage and fall asleep or start watching TV. Even they would invite friends over to play cards or whatever. With all this, of course, they weren't paying attention to their job, but they had a way to get along with it because there was camaraderie among the Punteros. And among them, they helped each other, for example. Point 3 called Point 2 and Point 4, and he told them, "Hey, when a unit passes by your point, call me on my phone or let me know. Something is going to pass, like a unit of soldiers." And when they heard that they were called on over the radio or their cell phone, then they look out the window to look for the units, to keep an eye on what was happening. But if there was no movement, they were never around. And sometimes, someone was sent to check if they were sleeping in the living room or watching a movie and so on. So they found that giving them a place didn't work. This infrastructure cost millions per week, and everyone wanted to use it, but no one wanted to contribute. And radios were lost weekly. Batteries. It was gasoline for the taxis, gasoline for the motorcycles, gasoline for the vehicles, also rent for the offices, and obviously the salary for the lookouts. And before I forget, I know you've seen it said elsewhere that they enter the organization as lookouts and they move up. Normally, that doesn't happen. But there are times that this happens. For example, the OSO named Ray David. He was a Special Forces soldier, left the army and joined the Ocran. He knew how to use tools and had military training, but his role in the company was to be a lookout in the mountains. That was his job. He was between the Sierra of Sinaloa and the Sierra of Durango at a point, keeping watch in case helicopters passed by. He was at a very high point and had a very good view for several kilometers. That was its function when the Pocha was in the mountains. But around 2006, the Licenciado pulled him down to Culiacan, and he put him in charge of a group of man-gun. But we will talk about that another time later. I'm just telling you, so you can see how it went from a Puntero to become one of the main lieutenants or member of an organization. Obviously, it's not the same, since he had a lot of knowledge from being in the army, but as you can see, there are more people who managed to rise up and ended being main or important pieces in an organization. And another very important event, where the Punteros' work seemed crucial, is when they caught El Pocha in Mazatlan. Like I told you in one of the first episodes, that day the Navy left from Culiacan, and they went through all the Punteros by the Maxipista. But since that information reached the Bravo, he didn't pass it on to the Pocha. And the most brazen thing of all is that the Bravo removed the Punteros at the entrance of Mazatlan, from the Zona Dorada and by the Malecon that were his, so that they would not notify anything at all if the Pocha had had that information. Obviously, he would have moved from that place, and would have been waiting for the alert as it moved from one point to another, so they could have decided to move. But well, since they didn't give him a chance of anything, what happened, happened. So that you would see this, the Bravo took away the Punteros in Mazatlan because he knew that could save the Pocha. Well, friends, as you can see, everything related to the lookouts, we now see their function and the dangers they face and see. Here I am going to show you some videos to make you realize that the danger is real. And even more for the monitors who chase down government units. They are in a lot of danger because they're chased by trucks and scouts, and they have to escape however they can. Sometimes going the wrong way, driving through the streets, between cars, at high speeds. And what happens? They get run over sometimes, other times they get resigned. The reality is that it's tough. Here it is for you to see.
Mira, pinga tu verga, güey.
And also for the ones from the company, here is the audio of Nini when he starts arguing with the Punteros.
Pinche atención, hijo de tu puta madre, güey, porque si no les voy a pegar una vergüenza a ustedes, oficina, güey. Y también al fe que se me mueva la verga. Que anden en motos, que anden valiendo verga. Les voy a pegar una vergüenza y les voy a atropellar a chingar su puta madre, ¿no? No me tienen hasta la verga. ¿Estás copiando tú, Kentucky? Con toda esa la putiza que te van a dar, verga. Y es para todos a la verga. Pega que se me mueva el punto. Yo voy a saber, le voy a pegar una vergüenza y le voy a correr a chingar a su madre. ¿Cómo están copiando por ahí?
Fuerte y claro.
Ahí están copiando, así te voy a...
Well, friends, I hope you've learned something and that everyone involved in this environment understands it better. And like I said, I won't get tired of saying it. The Punteros are fundamental for organizations. As I already told you, they are more important than the Tolerospi or Monguns. For security, as I explained to you, 30 bodyguards could be protecting the boss, but if they come across 10 military trucks, they're not going to do anything. Instead, just a puntero letting you know that near there is a truck of the military or even 200 military trucks, and with that notice give the boss enough time to escape, it's 1,000 times more effective, and so there is more chances of it escaping. Keep that in mind. This is how essential they are. Please, value them and don't humiliate or despise them. Because they also take risks, and not because they don't have equipment or tools, this doesn't make them less valuable or less smart. Sometimes they have courage and dare, so give them a raise because it will help. It's the main tool for security. Oh well, we know that punteros are also looked down upon by society just like their own bosses do. Besides having a very dangerous and risky job, they pay them very little. You better think about it, and don't get involved in that. It's not good at all. I recommend you look for another job, and if not, then ask for better benefits, a higher salary, and better treatment because you deserve it. Don't be swayed by the mentality that all those are trash. Not at all. Everyone's work is valuable, and the work of the Scouts is extremely important. Well, friends, we have reached the end of this episode. I hope you had a good time and found it interesting. You know I enjoy hearing your opinions in the comments. Tell me what you think about this profession, or if you have any stories about punteros that are related. Leave it in the comments. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you in the next episode. Don't forget that the unique and real narrative of the world of Ocran can only be found here. A big hug to everyone. See you next time.